Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I've been hunting elk for over 34 years, but most of that time wasn't spent doing things right. It was spent learning the hard way. I didn't start out knowing any of this stuff that we're going to talk about today. I didn't have a system. I didn't understand elk the way I do now. I made the same mistakes you're probably making right now, and I repeated them longer than I probably should have. And that's the truth a lot of elk hunters don't hear. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent elk hunter and outdoorsman. Most elk hunters waste a lot of years, not because they don't care and not because they're not working hard, but because they're learning the wrong lessons or not building on those lessons. They think experience alone, just being out there, is going to just magically fix everything. And I'm here to tell you it won't. Experience doesn't guarantee improvement. Only corrected experience does. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through what I got wrong early on, what actually changed everything for me, and how you can shortcut that learning curve so you don't spend years figuring this out the hard way. Failure number one, I hunted hard, but I didn't really understand elk. Early on, I did what a lot of elk hunters do. I just hunted hard. I covered miles. I pushed deeper. I prided myself on effort, toughness, and how much ground I could cover in a day. In my mind, success was simple. Outwork everybody else, and you'll eventually find elk and kill elk. It's what I had done my whole life in every other area. Just grind it out. And for a while, that mindset feels right. You're tired at the end of the day. You feel like you've earned it. You convince yourself you're getting closer. But here's what I started to realize. Effort didn't necessarily equal encounters. I was always just on the edge of something. Fresh sign, occasional bugles, glimpses of elk, but nothing consistent, nothing repeatable. It always felt like I was just one step away, but never actually in control of the situation. And that's frustrating because it makes you think you just need to push harder. What I didn't understand at the time was this: elk weren't random, and they weren't spread evenly across the landscape waiting to be found. They were living inside of structure. They fed during the night or low light. They transitioned through specific terrain. They bedded in secure locations where they could control wind and visibility. And most importantly, everything they did, every single thing, was survival driven, especially in pressured environments. Security always came first, always. And that means they chose terrain that gave them an advantage, not terrain that was easy for me to hunt. And I wasn't necessarily thinking like that. I was just moving through the mountains hoping to run into elk instead of understanding where they would be and why. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I've killed a lot of elk over those early years, but it was always random. And every single year I was just going out there hoping to repeat that. But this was the turning point. When I started to realize elk weren't random, everything changed. Movement started to make more sense. Location started to make sense. Encounters became something I could influence instead of something I was just hoping for. And that leads to the lesson I wish I understood much earlier. Hard work without elk understanding wastes a lot of time. You can put in all the effort you want, be as fit as you want, but if you don't understand how elk actually live, move, and respond to pressure, you're just guessing, and guessing doesn't lead to consistency. Failure number two, I hunted where it looked good, not necessarily where elk could survive the best. For a long time, I trusted what I could see. Maybe it was big basins or open ridges or wide scenic country that just felt right. It looked elky, the kind of places you look at and think, this has to hold elk. It made sense in my head. Maybe it was good visibility or good feed or just big country in general. It checked all the boxes. There was water nearby. And because of that, I had confidence in those spots. But confidence didn't mean that I was right. The reality was a lot of that country was completely empty of elk, or at best, very inconsistent. Maybe they were just passing through. I'd find occasional sign, maybe see elk once in a while, but nothing repeatable, nothing I could build on. And when it didn't work, I blamed timing, weather, pressure, or just bad luck. What I didn't realize was I was hunting places places that made sense to me, but didn't make sense to elk. I was focused on visual appeal, not functional habitat. And elk don't choose where they live based on how it looks from a distance. They choose based on survival. That means security first, always. They want terrain that gives them control, especially control of the wind. They want areas where they can move between feed and bed without exposing themselves. And under pressure, they don't disappear. They just shift into places that are harder to access, harder to see, and easier for them to manage. The nasty places. And that was the turning point for me. When I stopped asking, does this look like elk country? And started asking, can elk survive here really well during daylight? Everything changed. I started finding elk in places I used to overlook, like mid-slope timber pockets and broken terrain and transition zones that weren't necessarily obvious, but gave elk everything they needed: cover, wind advantage, and short, controlled movement between feed and bed. And those weren't the prettiest places on the mountain, but they were the most consistent. And that's the lesson. Elk don't live where it necessarily looks good. They live where they survive. Now, when I look at country now and I find where elk are, it looks good to me. But the difference between what looked good back then and what looks good now is completely different. And it doesn't look good now because I think that it necessarily looks pretty. It looks good now. It looks elky to me now because I know what kind of places they're looking for, what kind of pockets are going to keep them confident and secure and that are harder for other hunters to access. And those are the places that look beautiful to me now. And until you start thinking like that, you're going to keep hunting country that builds confidence but doesn't produce elk results. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post-Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory. It's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Failure number 3, I thought I understood wind until it kept beating me, and I had to dive into it deeper. For a long time, I thought I had wind figured out. Kept it in my face, always hunt into the wind, right? I paid attention to thermals. I knew the basics, up in the morning and down in the evening. And because of that, I had confidence in my setups. I felt like I was doing one of the most important things right. But the results didn't match that confidence. I kept getting blown out a lot of times and not understanding why. Encounters would fall apart before they even started, and elk would vanish, or, we'd bump them in front of us without making noise or without them seeing us and not understand why. No sound, no warning. Wind seemed okay. It was the thermals, right? They weren't what we had expected. The elk were just gone, and I couldn't explain it in the beginning. I'd replay it in my head, trying to figure out what I did wrong, and I kept coming back to the same conclusion. The wind should have been right. That wasn't the problem. I understood wind direction. I didn't understand wind behavior. Wind in elk country doesn't move in straight lines. It interacts with terrain. It shifts, it pulls, it rises, rises, it drops, it moves in ways that aren't obvious unless you spent really a lot of time paying attention to it. Timber breaks it up and causes it to drift. Benches can push it sideways. Bowls and basins create constant swirls. And thermals don't just flip, they transition, and that can create instability right when you think things should be more predictable. Elk live in that complexity. They love it. They position themselves to use it. They bed where they can scent check both above and below a lot of times. They move through terrain that protects their downwind side. And mature bulls expect wind to be inconsistent, which means they rely on that inconsistency to detect danger and hunters. And that was the turning point. When I stopped thinking about wind as direction and started thinking about it as movement through terrain, everything changed. I started recognizing when a setup wasn't huntable, even if it looked good on the surface. Morning thermals aren't rising if the sun hasn't warmed the slope yet. Midday thermals might not be rising if you're in a shaded draw or pocket. Evening thermals might not be dropping if the sun is still warming the slope. And the deeper insight was this: a lot of the time, elk knew I was there long before I knew they were there. And that's why the encounter never really evolved and happened. And that leads to the lesson I wish I understood a lot earlier. If you don't understand wind at this level, you don't understand elk hunting. Failure number 4, I chased elk instead of learning how to hunt them. For a long time, I hunted elk by reacting. I chased bugles. I moved toward fresh sign. If I saw elk in one spot, I went back there the next day expecting it to happen again. I was constantly adjusting on the fly, always trying to catch up to what had just happened. And it felt like hunting. I was active. I was engaged. I was doing something all the time. But the reality is, I was always behind. Every decision I made was based on where elk had been, not where they were going. And because of that, I was never in control of the encounter. The elk always were. I was just hoping to run into one. What I didn't understand at the time was that elk movement isn't random. It's very structured. They feed, they transition, they bed, and they do it through terrain that gives them an advantage. That means their movement is predictable if we understand what we're looking at. But I wasn't thinking like that. I was chasing movement and moments instead of learning their movement. And that's what was missing. I didn't understand positioning. I didn't think in terms of interception and predictability. I didn't have a structured way to make decisions. Everything was just reactive to what the elk were doing or when I finally saw them. The turning point came when I stopped trying to find elk in the moment, started focusing on where they had to go. I started identifying terrain features that forced their movement, like benches, saddles, side hill routes, and positioning myself ahead of that movement instead of behind it. And just as important, I learned to slow down once I was in elk. That part was huge. And that's when things really started to change. Instead of just bouncing around, I stayed in areas longer. I paid more attention to what was happening and how the elk were using them. And I built more understanding, and I started seeing patterns instead of just random hoping. And that's when I built a system. I started to locate elk. I started to evaluate the situation, see if it was huntable. I started to position myself ahead of their movement, tried to predict where they were going. I tried to execute with more control. And then, last but not least, I tried to adjust more based on what had happened or what I had learned from the situation. So I wasn't just starting from scratch every day. And that structure changed everything for me, because the lesson here is that success didn't come from chasing elk. It came from learning how to hunt them. And that only happens when you stop reacting and you stop operating with more of a system. And if I'm being honest, most of those 34 years that I've spent hunting elk weren't doing things right. They were spent learning what not to do, making mistakes, repeating them, and slowly figuring out what actually works. And that's the part a lot of elk hunters don't realize. You don't need decades to figure this out. What you need is corrected experience, not just time in the field, but the ability to recognize what's actually happening right now and then adjust your approach based on it. Because if you just repeat the same patterns, time doesn't help you. You're just going to stay stuck in those same patterns. So this is the shift. You don't need to pay your dues lose the hard way necessarily by just making years of mistakes like I did, right? It's a lot of hard work and we've always got to work hard at it. But you don't need to waste years chasing the wrong things. You can shortcut that learning curve by focusing on what actually matters. It didn't take me 34 years to learn elk hunting. It took me 34 years to stop doing it wrong in a lot of ways, in a lot of areas, right? Now, if you want to learn from even more of my failures and go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we have an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution all in real time. 90% of Elk Camp is going to be running you through elk hunting situations and scenarios. You can check out the Elk Camp at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.